A common theme we hear among veterans is the challenge of figuring out what's next after service, and how even the best laid plans can still lead to unexpected pivots. Our guest today, Jay Miseli, knows that firsthand. After a distinguished Army career, Jay went through a well structured transition process, including working with the Commit Foundation and setting clear intentions for the next chapter. But like many high performers, he found that his first role out of the military didn't quite fit. It looked right on paper, but lacked meaning. That experience sparked a period of deep reflection and reinvention. Jay is now the co-founder of Red Thread X, a company helping leaders navigate high-stakes conferences with clarity and impact. He's also a dad, a mountain biker, and someone who's thought deeply about the process of military transition, not just for himself, but for his family as well. Jay's wisdom on designing a life that matters, reinventing yourself without being typecast, and thriving through the lifelong transition process is applicable to anyone's situation. Thanks for joining us on this veteran venture. Most people you talk to when transitioning out of the military have never actually transitioned out themselves. You're probably getting a bunch of opinions from people who plan on staying in until retirement and have no idea how to actually show empathy for your situation. This podcast is about providing fresh perspectives and a front row seat for conversations with successful veterans doing big things after leaving the military.
Well, hello there. How you doing?
Good to see you.
Good to see you, Griffin. How are you, man?
Doing really well. That is a heck of a
Excellent.
wall you got behind you. That is awesome.
Oh, yeah, it's a little bit of the arc of life there for me. So,
Yeah, this is Jack Williams. Jack and I served together in 191, part of the 173rd in Germany.
okay,
He's a fellow armor guy.
nice.
I actually spent some time on tanks, unlike myself. I just borrow the affiliation to Armor Branch, but Jack truly lived it.
No, and we're gonna have to change the name to the podcast, maybe. I think you're the third armor officer in a row we've had, so
Nice.
we're getting real niche here.
There's way fewer of us, but compared to infantry guys, we just punch way above our weight, I think.
Oh,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. We bring real combat power to the fight. So,
That's right. Well, to jump into it here, Jack, I want to tell a quick story because you and I actually owe our relationship to Jay. And this, hear me out here. When I was getting out of when I was finishing ROTC, graduating school, trying to figure out kind of what my timeline looked like, I was about to start Bullock maybe like a week or two after graduating. It would have been right away. I wouldn't have been able to get married and I wouldn't have had a honeymoon. And I was freaking out about it, obviously. And so I talked to my professor of military science, who happened to be good friends with Jay, and he put me in touch with Jay. Jay completely saved my marriage and life by pushing back my Bullock date, allowing me to have a honeymoon, have some time between starting active duty. And one thing led to another. Because of that, I ended up at 191. Because I was at 191, Jack and I worked together and met. And so all of this stuff is largely thanks to Jay. So I'll just start with that little anecdote here. He's had a profound impact, even though from his perspective, he probably doesn't even remember the interaction.
that was the very least I could do. I mean, it was part of our role was to make sure that we took care of both soldiers and their families. And what a terrible way for you to start a career and your wife if we had done that to you the other way.
Well, and it pushed me back. It pushed me back a year group to where I maximized the timeline that I had, was able to go to additional schools, have more broadening time, all of the above. So it worked out really well and in ways that I never could have anticipated it would, aside from just being able to start off my marriage on the right foot, hopefully.
Right. And here we are almost 10 years later getting to continue a conversation.
That's right. Exactly. So with that, Jay, I'd love to dive into your background a little bit. If you could just talk through kind of your arc through the military and yeah, maybe just focus on military time, a little bit about your transition, and then we can get into what you're doing now as we kind of progress.
Yeah, that sounds great. So, Griffin and Jack, great to see you. And thanks so much for the opportunity to join you. As I was saying at the very beginning of the conversation, what's behind me on the wall is really a good representation of the arc I've followed. Over there in the corner, I've got my guitar, and I played guitar since I was about 12 years old. There's a really funny story about how guitar playing leads me to talking to you right now. So, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I had this deliberate word choice. I had this fantasy of playing guitar professionally for a living as I went through high school and graduated. And I went to San Francisco State University for the first couple of years after I graduated. And I've never met him, but I would like to meet him and thank him. I personally thank Kirk Hammett for me being a retired Army officer 30 plus years later. And the reason is I went from the Bay Area, San Mateo area up to San Francisco, and I got there and I realized as much as I enjoy playing and I'm pretty good at playing covers, I was never going to be a viable professional musician. And so after my first year of college there, I realized that, hey, this is not going to work if I want to get out there and eventually have a family in my own home and stuff like that. So I was like, crap, I got to reorient here really quickly. And right at the end of that first year, as I'm going through this, what in the world am I going to do with my life? I met a guy who was doing an Army ROTC. And he's like, hey, you ought to come check it out. So summer break happens. I go hit Army ROTC at the start of my second year of college. One of the instructors was a West Point grad. He grabs me and goes, hey, you really ought to think about going to West Point. I had no idea what he was talking about. And he explained it to me and he mentored me through the process. So I wound up applying to West Point my second year of college, got accepted, and went from maybe slightly longer hair than I have now and try to play guitar to Army ROTC cadet to West Point cadet. And then I graduated with the mighty class of 95 in June of 1995. And then I started my armored cav career. And it was just an incredible ride. I got to do such incredible stuff from being a tank, not a tank company commander. Well, I did command a tank company, but I was a headquarters company commander in 2003 during the invasion of Iraq. And there's a story I'll tell about that a little bit later. I got to command the finest cavalry squadron in the United States Army. It's my dream assignment. Got to command 17 Cav at Fort Hood, Texas. And I got to command Stryker Brigade up at Joint Base Lewis McChord and really end my career from brigade command to Afghanistan as the senior operations officer for the U.S. and NATO missions there, back to Joint Base Lewis McChord to be a Corps G3, and then Army Futures Command here in Austin. And that was my last assignment. And really, when we got back here to Austin, we knew Texas is where we wanted to land, and we had narrowed it down and we decided, hey, Austin's the place we want to go. And so that's the brigade set of colors there. And that leads to this piece over here. So got back to Austin in summer of 2021, got settled in. We had bought a home. We had just launched our youngest child off to school. And we looked at it and said, this is really where we want to be. Personally and professionally, it's a great place to live. And for me, the full circle moment really comes back to as I was working in Army Futures Command and learning the Austin environment, I realized that it felt just like the Bay Area had felt in the 80s when I was growing up as a kid in the early 90s. And that was that sense of optimism, the unbridled innovation and entrepreneurial spirit, certainly enough capital to actually back it. And so when I looked at this, I said, hey, Austin's on the front end of a growth curve that I want to be part of. And I know this vibe because I've lived it before. And my dad was in tech in the Bay Area. I'm like, no, I'm going to go ahead and get into this game now. And so I retired from the Army at the end of 22 at Army Futures Command. Great career, no regrets whatsoever. Appreciate every one of the twists and turns because they lead me to sitting here right now.
That is awesome. And had you intentionally landed in Austin as part of Futures Command? Was that part of it? It sounded like you'd already bought a house there. Had you kind of lined up those
Yeah.
pieces well in advance?
Yeah, it's funny, and I won't say which senior Army leader it is because he's still in uniform, but I had worked for an Army senior leader in Afghanistan, and he had rotated after about 90 days. So this was summer of 2019 when I got there. He rotated after about my first 90 days back, and lo and behold, he became a senior commander at Joint Base Lewis McChord. And as I was wrapping up my time in Afghanistan, he hit me up and said, hey, I'd really like for you to come be my operations officer at First Corps. We know each other. We've worked together. You know my style. I know your work ethic and everything else. And so we were talking. And I said, yes, I'd love to do that. It allowed me to line up my daughter's senior year of high school in Washington. So she was able to do all 4 years of high school there. And my wife was really flourishing in her new career. She had entered the workforce as we went to Washington. And so he knew I'd done 3 years in Washington. Well, I had done two, but our family had done three. And that I was looking for that fourth year in Washington. But it was also the toughest job I've ever had. I mean, it's a really engaging job with a lot of responsibility. So I asked him, I said, sir, I'll do it. I have two requests. I said, one, it's a 1 year job. You'll get 1 year work pace out of me, and that'll let me finish high school with my daughter. And I said, two, will you help me get to Austin afterwards? And I'm literally sitting in the Centurion Lounge at the Seattle airport, getting ready to fly back to Afghanistan. And he said, those are both absolutely fair requests. Yes and yes. And so based on that, we made the decision to contract on a new build home, recognizing that this officer, who's a man of his word, would stand behind it and help us get to Austin. And after working for him for a period of time as his operations officer, he did in fact help us line up the assignment down here. So we came down here knowing that the likelihood of having to throw any other parties but a retirement party was pretty low. And so we knew that this was a pivot point. But really, the way I saw it, it was a hedge against uncertainty. Didn't know there was one more promotion potential out there, albeit probably slim, just based on numbers. And so when we looked at it, we said, hey, let's go ahead and hedge against the uncertainty and go ahead and plan ourselves where we want to be for the long term. And if worse comes to worse, we had modeled it out as a hub and spoke model. So my wife could stay here, live in the house that we had built and bought, and I could go out and do Army adventures. And if the more likely outcome occurred, then we could plan one rip roaring retirement party and grow some roots and really build ourselves into the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, incredible foresight, but well executed, but also great laid plan in advance. Quick aside, where were you in Afghanistan in 2019? I was there at the same time in
Oh,
the
were you?
summer.
I was in Kabul. So whatever orders you got, they were good from my level. It just must have been between you and me. Yeah, I was at a headquarters Resolute support mission.
Oh, I was at HKI at that exact same time, I
Oh,
think.
were you?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I was over at HQRS working for ComRS on the
nice.
J3 side.
Awesome. Yeah, I was right across the fence at the embassy in 2020, about a year later as well. So a lot of
Yeah,
overlap there.
not quite what we planned, but we'll save that for a different discussion.
Yeah. Well, also, one thing that you mentioned in a previous conversation I think is really insightful and I think helpful for a lot of people is that transition is a lifelong process, especially a transition from the military. Given the fact that's really the kind of the slant of this podcast is helping people work through that process, figuring out what is really their next steps after they've made that transition. Could you just speak to that concept a little bit and how you've kind of seen that in fruition for yourself and kind of your own personal story, how it's been a lifelong process and for all of us continuing to make that transition every day?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so, yes, just to restate what you already stated, what I have learned in the 2+ years since I retired from the Army, and really I transitioned out of the Army. I have not retired. I'm still working. I'm still having fun, just in a new phase of life, is that it is unequivocally, it's a lifelong, ongoing process. So going back in time, in my mind, I'm a chronic planner, and I thought, hey, there's going to be discrete phases. And I have to say, thanks to the best transition program for me personally, it was the Commit Foundation because their core premise is pursuing your purpose. So they want to help you find your purpose and then line up how you can go achieve that purpose. And they're not a job placement firm. They're not helping you find a job, but they're helping you understand your purpose and then really narrowing down the field. And I've gone through an evolution of my thinking. My initial thought on my purpose was to continue to help organizations improve on a recurring basis, similar to what I've done in the Army. You show up and you take your organization, and your job is to return it to the Army better than you found it. And it's not that the person before you was good or bad. It's just they got it to a certain level based on their requirements and resources. And then your job is to continue this improvement over time. So I set the personal objective of going into small commercial or dual use technology, staying in the Austin area, fairly reasonable. So I'm in Austin. There's a lot of SAC here, a lot of dual use opportunity. But I set the goal of going into a small commercial or dual use tech company because I wanted to learn business operations from the inside. And I wanted to be part of a company that could realize its potential. So I saw here's where the company is, here's where they want to go, and I'd like to be part of that growth curve. So really almost a subset of what I envisioned with Austin and our growth potential and where we are as a community. And so I did that for the first 2 years. I joined in with a small company, great opportunity. I'm incredibly thankful for what I got to learn there working with them. But what I realized was my purpose was not just putting on slacks and a shirt every day and working sales and business development to help just generate revenue. It was more than that. It just wasn't quite aligned. And in large part, it had nothing to do with that company or what we were doing. What it really boiled down to was I wasn't being able to apply my creativity. And so you'll see that there's a couple of arcs here, but that thing right there, I love being creative. I love working with my hands. I love producing things. And in the end, I was not able to really fully realize that inside of working a full-time 9 to 5 type of gig. So two things had manifested as 2024 was ending. The first is I do some part-time work, still supporting Army Futures Command with wargaming, and it's just plain fun. And the requirements for that were increasing. So they were going to need a little bit more time than I'd been allocating prior. And I looked at that and said, that's a good opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and commit to that. But much more importantly, and that's where this thing comes in, my startup, Red Thread X, was really gaining momentum from 24 into 25. And we had set South by Southwest in 2025 as our minimal viable product deployment date. And so with that looming, and the fact that I'm incredibly blessed because I've got my retirement, my military retirement pension, and my medical benefits from the military as a fallback. So the entrepreneurial spirit, I did have a hedge against that, thankfully. And so I looked at this and I said, I got a chance to increase the wargaming. I love that. And I've got a chance to truly build something with my co-founder from the ground up that we're going to own, and we're going to own all the results and outcomes, all the decisions and everything else. So responsibility and authority, 100% aligned. And I didn't have that in the full-time gig, just like in many roles in the Army. I always had this, I didn't always, but a lot of times I had a responsibility or authorities mismatch. Like, you're responsible for this, but you only have these authorities. I'm like, wait, well, you can't do that, or vice versa. Like, here's some authorities, but, and so I looked at it and I said, no, this is what I want to do. So really the evolution of my purpose was the chance to do a true passion project and commit to something that I was building with my co-founder and that we see as a viable business going forward.
And did you realize that through being part of the Commit Foundation, or was that something that you were in Commit's program, got into that first initial job, realized that you didn't have that kind of matched authority, and then you then made the transition there? How did that sequence go with Commit Foundation and your purpose?
So I think the Commit Foundation planted the seed, but I think part of their approach is, we're going to show you a light and you got to decide if that's the light or not. I think the trap I fell in was, so I think they showed me what my purpose was: building something, helping something build and improve and grow. I think I took that purpose as an output from Commit Foundation, and I'm not going to say misapplied it, but it wasn't fully aligned in the path I initially chose. And knowing now what I know, that happened because I fell in the trap of not breaking a paradigm. Is what happens during your time in the Army. You get a set of orders, you get a job. And in fact, when I was retiring, as I was going through the transition window, and you guys know because you're in industry, you don't know your next job 6 months out. Nobody's hiring on a semi-annual basis. We're going to sit here and hold this job for you until you're out of the Army there, Jay. And so, but months and months along the march to retirement, hey, Jay, you got your new job yet? What's it going to be? What are you going to do? Things like that. And so I allowed myself to fall into the paradigm of, well, of course, what you do is you go from one full-time job to another full-time job. And here was the principal identity that occurred for me. And it wasn't until February of this year that I can now go back in time to that retirement window in my transition into industry. Like it or not, a core element of our value of an individual certainly in American society and arguably in Western society is what you do. And I followed that paradigm. I wanted to be able to answer when someone said, what do you do? You say a position in a company, and then you kind of go into that little butt sniffing cycle of, well, what's their revenue? How many employees? You guys know exactly the conversation, right? And what's the first question we ask when you meet a stranger in America? What do you do, right? What do you do? And what's the answer? We don't say, hey, I mountain bike and I hike and I fish and I play guitar. We say, I am this role in this organization with this revenue, with this number of employees. And what we do is we're all of a sudden reframing and we're creating this little box of, well, here's your value proposition is a role in an organization of a certain size and revenue. And that was the moment in February this year when I realized what had happened back in the December of 22, January 23 window is I had followed the paradigm of full-time job in the Army, a little bit of leave, probably too much leave because my wife's like, okay, you're around a lot. I'm like, isn't this great? No, you were never around and now you're around. And then all of a sudden, okay, boom, jump into industry and you got a job and it's a 9 to 5 gig and you're just kind of marching along and you've got a identity that's tied to your job. And that's ultimately what I sought to break. And knowing now what I know, that seed of purpose from Commit Foundation and the entrepreneur running a startup in Austin is the correct linkage. But the mountain bike ride, it's not a straight line path. If I hadn't had the twists and turns to get me here, then I wouldn't necessarily appreciate the opportunity I've got.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think the pressure to have that title and the income and matching that is even greater for people who aren't retiring. Now, of course, you were a high level, high ranking officer who has a lot of capability and a lot of experience. So there is some pressure to then fill another major role. But if you're getting out at the 10-year mark, you're also pressured from your family and from your close friends to think, hey, well, he or she chose to get out of the military. So now what the outcome is really dependent, because he could have just stayed in the military and been successful, probably retired, done the whole thing. but there's also a lot of pressure to have that title and to have that income when you're transitioning pre-retirement. And I think that's incredibly valid. But what you found is, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, the title and the money isn't always the most important thing. You have to find something that can scratch the itch and not just do what you love to do. You have to fill those other voids and make sure you're providing for your family, but you have to follow something that's going to make you happy and provide fulfillment outside of just money and title.
Oh, absolutely, Jack. In fact, it was a little bit over a year ago. There was a very short blurb in a James Clear newsletter, and I really like, he's the author of Atomic Habits. Really like his writing. I love that book. And this newsletter he sends out weekly. And the little blurb, it basically said there are at least four forms of wealth. I'll paraphrase it: money, status, time, and your well-being. And he, in essence, said, be wary of requirements of the latter two for the first two, because it'll be too late. And that was the first moment when I realized, and again, I'm in a very different scenario. We're empty nesters. My wife is working. She's a professional in her industry. I've got the pension from the military. I looked at it and I said, this is my opportunity to control my time, to work with that sense of purpose, but I'm shedding a position or status of a title in a company and a role and everything else. And I had some trepidation getting to that point when I resigned from that full-time job. And I realized it was because I was breaking a paradigm and an expectation that had always been in place for me for over 30 years.
How do you think someone could deliberately not fall into that trap? How could someone avoid the trap of not breaking the paradigm? Looking back on it now that you are kind of on the other side of that experience, are there practical ways of doing it, or does it require kind of falling into that trap and realizing once you're in it that you need to escape?
Well, so part of the reason I'm really excited to be able to talk to you is if one person hears this podcast and can make a better informed decision than I made, because they at least know whatever path they follow, that they're making a deliberate decision to follow a path, then that means all the time that we're investing and that you're going to use to edit and distribute this is worth it. So I went through an evolution of models, and I've got some dear friends out there who will laugh their tails off if they hear this because they jokingly call them Miseli models. But I like to take ideas, abstract ideas, and distill them into concrete models. Because for me, it helps me think through what the solution space looks like. So the very first model I came up with was a little quad that had money and status on one side and time and well-being on the other. And that one wasn't really completely viable, but it helped me understand like where I was putting my energy, where I was putting my time, and what reward I was getting. So what the feedback loop looked like. I ultimately came up with just a simple arrow, horizontal line, arrowheads on each end. And the arrow said freedom under the middle of the arrow. And on one side it said financial, and on the other side it said temporal. And that's when I realized that I just was going to put myself on a sliding scale. And I knew where I was at the time, and I knew where I wanted to be. And it was a matter of what decisions do I have to take to place myself on that sliding scale where I want to be. And that's when I realized that everything else would follow around that. Because in essence, there's a straight line correlation between income and position and the size of company you're working for and things like that. But that's also going to take you further away from freedom of your time. And of course, if you go to the other side and you don't do any professional endeavors whatsoever, you have a lot of free time, but you're potentially going to have some financial risks incurred as well. So ultimately, I would say if anybody's out there is considering a job, an industry pivot, a role, just look at where that puts you on that sliding scale. And you'll find that whatever's the priority for you, and there's no good or bad, it's an individual choice. Whatever your priority is, if you prioritize that level of freedom, everything else will follow.
That's really well said. Maybe we can have a separate conversation going through the Miseli models because that's I'm sure that you've got some very interesting ones. We'll love to go through some of those. Were there any other, you mentioned the Commit Foundation, which we've heard several people just speak really highly of those folks. Were there any other groups that were helpful or part of your transition that you worked with?
Actually, yes. There was a lot of individuals. There were two principal groups that were really influential for me. First was there was a narrow subset of, and I'm going to say this as a term of endearment, but graybeards, mentors that I've known for 20 years or more, therefore older than me, civilian and military mentors who really helped me understand how to translate a career in the Army into service and industry. And that group of mentors, they know who they are. They were profoundly influential in my thinking and understanding exactly where I could map into industry as I was understanding how that seed of create and build something from Commit Foundation maybe wasn't perfectly aligned with create and build something working in a small, but at least I got to build and grow something as a small and then create that feedback loop. So the set of mentors was profoundly influential in my thinking. And then the other is my contemporaries, my peers. There is a great peer group here in Austin that multiple years ahead of me in transition. We all are very collaborative now. And that peer group was great about understanding the not only the mechanics of the transition, because it is really poorly, as you guys know, you've transitioned. You would think that you're the first person ever getting out of the army. The way like, all of a sudden someone tells you, like, oh, you need this memo signed in purple ink by a vampire at dusk. And you're like, wow, where is that written?
Applicable to my experience because I was on a two-star staff at the time. So my direct supervisor was a colonel, my chief of staff was a colonel, and I had a brigade administrative colonel. So I had three colonels that needed to sign everything that I did.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
All
nuts.
in
So it's
purple.
like,
In purple.
exactly. Get
One
your
was
purple
purple,
ink.
one was pink, and then one was invisible ink that we had
Yeah,
to.
yeah. So there was this great cohort of peers, and they're still great peers now. We talk regularly in this group that really, so they're here in the Austin area here. We have a great ongoing dialogue. So the way I would frame it is from a macro or strategic perspective, the Gray Beard mentors were really helpful in going from this to this, and then contextualizing that for the Austin environment and specifically what I was looking to do with defense and the tech ecosystem and innovation. That group of contemporaries was really helpful.
Yeah, I've got a question we actually haven't really focused on with other guests, but since you mentioned your wife is a professional in her own right, how did the transition from the military differ, allowing you to weigh her profession? Because the Army controls a lot, right? The decision making, you have a little bit of wiggle room, but I've personally, we made the decision to transition out very heavily focused on what my wife was doing professionally. So, how did you tackle that, and how did you weigh those options, and how did that support her professional pursuits throughout the transition?
That's a great question, Jack. And I'm really glad you asked that because I do want to highlight her role as the matriarch of our family, everything she did raising our kids, and balancing the trade-offs she had to make. So, deliberate decision on our part when our son was born in 2000. She left the workforce. We were running parallel careers. She left the workforce when he was born under the auspices, and that was pre 9/11, that the demands of my continued service would be such that we wanted to make sure at least one parent was in a stable place to help take care of our son. And if we had any other children, those children as well. And of course, 9/11 happens, just come out of tank company command, had just gone to a headquarters company. And as we all know, the world changed fundamentally for us, especially in the US Army. So she was this just this rock solid foundation for our family. And as I came out of squadron command and went to a post squadron command job up at Human Resources Command, we saw an opportunity. And she had looked, and this is a criticism, and you just have to know that critical is a good word in my book. So when I say something critical, it's because I want to see either myself or people I care about or organizations I care about improve. So criticism of the Army. As we were getting ready to move up to Fort Knox for this human resources job, we realized that there's really no safety net for a military spouse who's committed to supporting a career until you hit 20. And there's this really vulnerable window there, pre 20, where you're just marching along. She's a realist, she's more of a realist than I am. I'm a true optimist, but she's a realist, and she realized you just never know, something could happen. And as an example, I'd been investigated as a major, had several investigations along the line, and you just never know if an investigation like that could, what if it's founded, could derail your trajectory, and all of a sudden you're left hanging, you don't have a job, and your spouse doesn't have a resume or anything like that. So deliberate decision as we moved up to Fort Knox, and I was before 20 years, so we knew where we were. She went back to grad school, got a master's degree, and completed that. It's in nonprofit management. So she's able to follow her passion of supporting soldiers, veterans, and their families. And that's expanded now with the Gold Star families as well in the communities they're in with her current role. And so she graduated from her master's degree as we were moving up to Fort Lewis or Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington, for me to go into brigade command. And what's interesting is her going back into the workforce, and she made a deliberate decision to go back in the workforce as our daughter started high school. And it was a decision that we had discussed extensively. Part of it was based on at the brigade command level, you've got battalion commanders and CSMs and entire family readiness structures around soldiers and their families. So we looked at this and said, we have this highly capable autonomous cell with each battalion, the brigades over the top of that. So we're much more structural procedural process than we are like hands-on dealing with soldier issues and family issues. And our daughter was going off to school. She was our youngest. So we looked at this and said, hey, this is a really good time to get back into the workforce. So she re-entered the workforce in 2017 and worked in a job for about 2 years. And when I was in Afghanistan, late 2019, she got an opportunity to join her current organization. And this was a real eye-opening moment for me. They hired her to do a regional level job up in the Pacific Northwest. And this is my assessment. I think she was slightly overqualified for the job, but it was a vacancy. It was a critical need for that organization at the time. And the way I personally frame it is I think they saw this as her line time in a developmental arc to prepare her for a subsequent role. And she was very transparent when she joined him. She said, hey, listen, sometime in about the next year and a half or 2 years, we're absolutely going to move from Washington. And if it's our choice, we're going to be moving to Texas, back to the Austin area. And I think that actually fit this organization's arc for her service because they basically lined up where she did about 18 months of line time doing this regional job and then matriculated into a national level position marching towards her current position, which is a senior director in the organization. And I think all of that was a deliberate arc that they were setting conditions for her. So in the end, it was favorable for her to come to Austin. So that's the other piece of advice I would offer, going back to the previous question, is always look at the personal and professional costs and benefits. And in this particular case, we knew that personally, Austin was the right place for us as a family. Professionally, it was the right place for her. And it was pretty easy to extrapolate that Austin would have a lot of professional opportunity for me with my both professional and academic background.
Well, I like the idea. I mean, of course, you clearly had a trajectory that was going to be perfectly fine and you were going to land on your feet. But what we do try to tell people is if you're able to get your spouse involved in a career to help with that transition. So you're not your feet aren't held to the fire to the point where you have to make a choice on a job just to make ends meet. And that if the spouse can, and we always, I mean, frankly, a geographic move halfway across the world could be accompanied with an ETS, right? So
Right.
some people don't get to just ETS and stay in the house that they're in, but enabling that career during that transition can help with the decision making. And we've seen that a lot. Not everybody has the opportunity to do that, but if you can do something during the transition to help with it, that's a great plan.
Yeah. Jack, I'm so glad to hear that you and Griffin are messaging that because the way I would go back, I'll joke a little bit, self-effacing here and say a Miseli model is really it afforded both of us to pivot on identity and purpose because we all know the Army ends for every single one of us. And if you act surprised when it ends, I mean, there's certainly circumstances where it can be a little to no notice exit from the Army, but for the significant majority of us, it's a known quantity. It's going to end at some point in time. You can generally predict when that is. And so what I really appreciate is that Charlene saw the opportunity to invest in the skills that aligned with her purpose, and she rewrote her professional identity and never lost the Army spouse and Army mom identity either. But she was able to intertwine all of those before we were facing a transition. So it wasn't like you said, Jack, it wasn't this cliff of crap, we're going to lose all the income except for this. And we're in a house in Austin and all the other stuff. So yeah, she has a lot of foresight and really invested in a deliberate path to get to this point.
It's also worth mentioning that, like, when my wife started to find some success and I wasn't the only breadwinner, it made me a better officer. Because to your point, you're always thinking, like, if there's a looming, if there's some possibility that there's an investigation or something, like, I have to get to 20 to make this work. But when she started to make good money, I was able to say the things that I needed to say respectfully. And like, I was absolutely mission focused and trying to find mission success, but I was able to speak a little bit more freely to my commanders because I wasn't so worried about my career. I was just worried about getting it right and accomplishing the mission. And not to say that I wasn't I was a decent communicator with my superiors before that, but it kind of opened up for me to be a little bit more clear and say the things that I needed to say as a subordinate to support what the mission needed. So it's not a bad idea to have your spouse get in the workforce and figure it out.
And to have an XO who can swat away any potential investigations as well, right, Jack?
Well, I just had you jump on the landmine, so
That's right. This one's for you, Griff. Go ahead.
exactly.
Jay,
So
Jay, I'd love to transition a little bit and talk about what you're doing currently with Red Thread X. So you hinted at it a bit, but could you talk about what you guys are working on and the scope of that company?
Yeah, absolutely. So Red Thread X is my startup. We're a little bit over 1 year old now. We established the LLC in June of 2024, but the core idea started in January 2024. So my co-founder Barry and I, we both were members of an innovation and foresight group, and our backgrounds could not be more different. He's got this incredible career, high performance apparels and fabrics, how that supports outdoor activities. So he's worked in the apparel industry for a long time, really cut his teeth on really tight margins, high quality, competitive market stuff. And I consider this a compliment, but as I was transitioning, one of my friends joked, he's like, "Hey, being a disruptor finally caught up with you, huh?" And I was like, I said, "I'm gonna take that as a compliment, you guys. I meant it as one." And so I like to think that I would at least challenge thinking and norms and conventions, both in uniform and now doing that out of uniform. Because going back earlier, I said critical is a good word. So we should have critical dialogue and we should allow for critical thinking. So I like your point, Jack, about like, hey, you can have that critical dialogue. It's a little bit liberating in that regard. And so Barry and I, in January 24, we were talking to the group of innovation and foresight leaders across the industry that were members of this group. And we were talking about South by Southwest and how valuable it is. I mean, it's if you don't know South by Southwest, if you haven't been here in Austin in March, it is absolute chaos, but it is wonderful chaos. To put it in perspective, in 2025 at the Consumer Electronics Show, they had about 140,000 people go for CES in Las Vegas. South by Southwest is really a tech conference and a film and music festival all kludged together. And under the model that was in place up to this year, you have the tech conference first and then it tapers off and then the film and music festival picks up. This year, there were over 250,000 people at the tech conference. So people think of CES as the world's largest tech event, and it's huge, but it's relative to South by Southwest. So we were talking about the value of South by Southwest and all the incredible insights and learning that can occur there. And most of the group was kind of, "Oh, we're not really buying what you're saying." And understandably, there's a lot of barriers to coming to Austin in March for South by Southwest. It is crowded, it is chaotic. If you don't know where you're going, you'll never find anything of significant value in terms of content you can extract. And so we made an offer. We said, "Hey, we're organizing our plan for South by Southwest anyways. So if anybody wants to come down and join us, we will in essence be your Sherpas for South by Southwest in 24." And we actually had 10 people agree to do it. So all of a sudden we went from Barry and I to 12 people as basically a pod experiencing South by South. And we weren't tour guides. So it wasn't show up at this street corner at this time so we can go over to this booth. We gave everyone a roadmap, 4 or 5 options per time block and say, "Hey, go choose your own adventure. Let's just stay in touch via communications channel and go through this." And on the last night, we all got together and we just all talked about our collective insights. And that was the first aha moment for us with Red Thread X, because we realized that on the front end, making order of the chaos with our organizing principles meant that we went to high value content and we heard the most interesting and useful insights from these really critical leading thinkers. And we were able to harvest that and then consolidate it together. So we heard everyone's insights and we were taking detailed notes. So we returned a report to them and we got really good feedback on the report. So we said, okay, we've got there now there's a knowledge value to an event like this. It's not just it was organized on the front end, but we're able to find the signal from the noise and return that via report to whoever was there. And if you're not there, you can still extract a lot of value just by reading the report. So we decided to go ahead and form the company. And then when we did our strategy session in late summer, we said, okay, let's swing for the fences. We're both big thinkers. So we set South by Southwest 2025 as our minimal viable product or MVP for Red Thread X. And we had some further evolution in our business model. And so we still organized the front side. So we took all the complexity. And oh, by the way, those 250,000 people, they're trying to figure out which event out of 1,700 to go to. So it's also, we're dealing with large numbers in terms of who's there and the things that they can go do. And we wanted to make sure we applied those organizing principles. So we did that. We had agendas, we had people come in, but we also found another value proposition. And we were very fortunate to have sponsors that gave us a venue where, or they allowed us to use a venue where we had watch parties. So some of the speakers are so profound that there will be 3 or 4 hour lines to get in to see them. And we know that, can tell you which ones are going to be the highest value events, which ones will have the longest lines through our predictive models. So when they have those really high value events, and if South by Southwest is doing a live simulcast, then we would run a watch party in the venue we had available. And that way you don't have to stand in line for a couple hours. You can watch it with a cohort. You can have a little dialogue. There's coffee. You can charge your phone and everything. So we mapped out these watch parties in our venue and had all that lined up. And then we realized that we had one of the most valuable resources in Austin in March. We had space during South by Southwest. So, and we are official partners with South by Southwest. So we had a partnership for the first part of our model. We went ahead and organized what we called the Red Thread House. And in South by vernacular, a house is an unofficial location outside of the South by Southwest official venue and content space. So of the 1,700 some events this year, 450 were South by official events, panels and speakers, and the other 1,300 or so were unofficial events, generally spread around the town in houses. Part of the reason it's so chaotic because you're like, wait a minute, you need me to go to the Central Texas house or the Australia house. What the heck? And so we had the Red Thread house, we had the watch parties mapped out, and we realized this was a chance to give people, our peers and our contemporaries, an opportunity to speak during South by Southwest, which is a huge value proposition. So we became an official activation with South by. We were a house, and we wound up doing 17 panels, 42 different speakers, over 1,000 registered attendees to come to the Red Thread House to hear these different panels. Wide-ranging topics, really powerful insights. We learned a lot just from listening to the folks who were on our stage, much less everything we learned from all the other events happening across Austin. So when we mapped all this out, we realized that our core business model is business to business or B2B. And our B2B product is the strategic business intelligence or actionable insights that come out of these events that happen throughout the country quarter after quarter. And so we've organized the business intelligence and the insights to be an output of a quarter. And we look at the highest impact events during that quarter, capture what's occurring there, use that in our analysis, and then use that to generate a report. So as an example, in first quarter, we used CES, National Retail Federation, and South by Southwest as our three macro events. And Griffin, I owe you huge thanks because we also pulled in information from Commodity Classic because we're really interested in innovation in agriculture and that how that ties in with food security and longevity of the human experience. So we use those macro events. We're also pulling in articles, TED Talks, anything that's relevant to the topics, and we generate the report. And so the evolution in our business model is everything I just described holds. And we're incredibly thankful because we've got our first corporate partner who is subscribed to our report for the year. So that's underway. We've delivered the first product to them and we've got subsequent deliveries ahead of us. But we realized there's a final component we want to extract. We looked at that Red Thread House model and we said, we believe this is transportable so that the entire element of what we did can go to other events. And so we were designing what it would look like at the Consumer Electronics Show in January of 2026. And myself being a veteran and a couple other guys on the team being veterans, we looked at AUSA, the Association of United States Army's national convention in October, and we said, there's an opportunity to have some critical dialogue, challenging discussion on some tough Army problems with leading thinkers in a venue where we can have this discussion, we can capture the insights, and that can ultimately feed into our understanding and our reporting. And so we're very fortunate in that the partnership pool has really grown, and we're still tied with South by Southwest, and we have now gotten permission from AUSA National to host a house during AUSA. So on Tuesday, October 14th, during AUSA, we're going to have an event. We're calling it AUSA Unscripted, where panel sponsors can choose a topic and panel members. They can have a 1 hour panel, just like we would see at South by Southwest. So really get into some topics, allow for some questions and answers, and we can have this tough dialogue about problems that are out there facing the Army.
That's all. It's like literally organizing the chaos. It just seems it's a massive undertaking. Are you guys using AI models or tools to be able to sift through this stuff, or how are you taking all the information and organizing it into that report?
That's a great question, Jack. And this is not like an advertising slogan response. The short answer is we're using the human element to get to both that front end on the organizing and that back end with the reporting. And I say that because while we can use some small focus tools, and we are working with some data analysts to help us do data scraping. So rather than manually going through 1,700 events, we can data scrape, build some tabular data, and pull that in. What we found was on the front side with organizing, LLMs just don't do anything because an LLM is going to tell you AI is a big topic at South by Southwest. You're like, thanks. What are the most important topics at South by Southwest? AI. You're like, okay, thanks. So what we found was Gen AI specifically and LLMs, not much use on the front side. Some very specific algorithms to do data scraping to help us. It's because part of the cultural zeitgeist of South by Southwest, it's maddening for a planner like me, but you won't see things like agendas and locations until just a few weeks out. In fact, there were some organizations whose houses during South by Southwest, unofficial stuff, we didn't get their agendas until a week out. And their website was just splashing, coming soon, our agenda, keep watching. And we're like, we're watching. And then finally, a week out, it's like, here's our agenda. And all of a sudden, we've got to pull in another 40 or 50 events to then go into our decision making about what's the highest value. So we tried using AI on the front end to see if it could streamline things, and it really didn't help us much. But the data and analytics does help there. On the back end, what we found was we do use AI in one very specific role, and that is in transcribing verbatim. So we use data recorders and transcription tools to get every word. So that way, you're not sitting there trying to capture every single insight when you're watching a panel, whether you're watching it online or watching it on YouTube afterwards, or you're in the room. You can really focus a little bit more on what are the macro ideas, what's the context of how they're delivering the message. You can focus on reading the slides and not trying to type what they're saying or write what they're saying while you're trying to read the slide and everything else. So what we found was using a data recorder to get a verbatim transcription is very helpful to go back and find those key insights. But then there's a counterpoint to that. We did an experiment and we tried running transcriptions through some AI tools to summarize those. And the summaries weren't bad on big ideas. But what we discovered was the AI tools really could not capture the true tactile feel. They wouldn't bring quotes forward. So we might have been in the room and heard somebody say something really profound, like in capture, like that's a really interesting quote. And if we went with an AI summary, the AI summary wouldn't go back to quotes. It would just say, here are the big topics, AI, biotechnology, whatever. And if we didn't go back and go to the raw material and use that as a source, then we ran the risk of losing the nuance. And ultimately, what we see as our value proposition is we're applying human judgment, human creativity, and insight on the raw data. So at least as of now, it's not a good connective tissue, but we also don't want to just be an AI summary machine either. We want to make sure that we're talking second and third level of detail type of stuff when we're presenting our reports.
Well, it's quite clear how passionate you are about this work, which is really cool. It makes me think. I'm so thankful that I mean, I'm sure you're grateful for the couple of years you spent in a different role after transitioning out of the Army, but so thankful that you took the risk to step into something new and uncharted, because it's obvious you're living into that passion that you found post-military. And it makes me think about, I mean, anyone listening is like, well, Jade probably doesn't have any experience in creating professional reports based off of these tech conferences across the country, but because you reinvented yourself in line with that purpose that you discovered. So I think that's such a great testament to finding that new purpose, really pursuing it, regardless of what we mentioned earlier, title and pay, regardless of those two factors, going after that in a way that really lights you up and ultimately probably is resulting in pretty good financial outcomes as well.
Well, I'm incredibly thankful. And if I could pass a piece of advice on for your listeners as they're contemplating their transitions, executing them, and then reflecting on where they are in that lifelong transition. And there's really two principal ideas I'd like to share. The first is I'm going to call it a mistake. For my first year or so in industry, working the full-time gig, I shelved most of my military tools. because I wanted to see what are industry practices. And I didn't want to say, well, here's my Army tool bag because I can solve any problem in the Army. And I'm just going to try and wedge this into the civilian workforce and everything else. And after a year or so, I realized that I was very fortunate to leave with an incredible set of tools. And by tools, I mean skills, the knowledge, the experience I carried, as well as some practical things like how we organize around time and efforts, how we synchronize activities and outcomes. So the first part was those are really powerful tools. I don't think I really lost anything by shelving them for a year, but I probably was suboptimal as a result of not applying those. But then the counterpoint is I wouldn't know the value of them if I hadn't not used them for a period. And then the other point I would like to make is this is the crux or the principal challenge with transition. We're used to going and doing whatever we're told to do. So I started off as an airborne tank platoon leader in the 82nd Airborne Division on Sheridan's. Did that. Then we deactivated and I showed up at Fort Hood and I was supposed to go to a tank company. Then I got pulled to the protocol shop. And then I got very fortunate to land in the Corps headquarters working as an aide for the Corps Chief of Staff. So I went from airborne tank platoon leader to core budget operations, readiness, and everything else in the span of just a couple of months. And then from there, I went to a tank platoon for just a little bit to learn to Abrams because I'd been on Sheridan's before. And then I was a tank company XO, and then I was a battalion maintenance officer. That was my lieutenant years until I went off to the career course. And we have the same cultural bent. Okay, all right, boss, you're telling me I'm the BMO. I'm going to go be the BMO, and I'm going to do the best I can with the tools I have available. And so you roll up your sleeves, you get out the regs, you learn, you listen to people. The here's the crux of that when you go out into your transition. We are really good generalists at every level in the Army, but that doesn't translate into a value proposition in industry because they don't want you to solve whatever problem you're going to do. Or the biggest single mistake I made in transition was when I first decided I was going to retire, the very first person I told said, what do you want to do? And I said, tech. And like 5 seconds later, I'm like, you idiot. Like, what is tech? Tech. And I was like, you just screwed up an opportunity to communicate with somebody about where you see yourself landing in your transition and where you want to work and what you want to do in industry. And that was the moment when I realized, like, crap, I hadn't really thought through how to think through and then identify and then vocalize what I want to do and be specific in that because I'd never worked in a world of specificity before. I always served where needed, did the job I was told to do, made sure I just learned how to do it. And so looking at my resume, I was like, oh, I can land anywhere. I can do this, I can do that. And once I realized that, and there was a single person who was really influential in my line of thinking on this. So I had this notion of I wanted to be at the confluence of strategy, learning and development, and human resources practices in industry. Basically, Jim Collins, good to great. Right person, right bus, right seat. And what I realized is a straight-laced ops guy coming out of the Army who came by his gray hair naturally does not look like an HR person in industry. And so I was offering a role that I envisioned that was completely misaligned with the mental model, much less the fact that's a really specific investment if an organization is going to try and bring those things together. And I fortunately had someone tell me, like, no, you're an operator. You solve problems, you're an ops person. Start communicating in ops language with industry, and you'll start to see alignment. And that's when I went from this misalignment of what I want to do versus how others saw me to, oh, I communicate as an operator. And that's how I landed in my full-time roles. I communicate as an operator seeking to do an operations role, then I can help line up what is a natural fit for the skills and experience I'm bringing with a level of specificity that's commensurate to me and the potential role.
Right. I think it's a great point. I think, and this isn't just all encompassing true for Army and true for industry, but it seems to me like when you are hired for a job on the civilian side, they just want you to do that job. And in the Army, it's almost like if you can do more, we're going to give you more and we're going to pile on. And of course, I'm sure there's certain industries and certain civilian companies that are fine with that. But they almost, it's like, no, stay in your lane. Like, don't get out of your little bubble here because it just seems like they have much more structured roles. Whereas in the military, we have roles and responsibilities, of course, but you're almost like yes, this guy can handle 3 jobs at once. Let's go for it.
Yeah,
So,
an industry, they're looking for one person that can solve the one problem that's assigned to that job. And again, that problem could be pretty wide ranging, but they're looking for a very specific tool. Whereas in the Army, as Jay mentioned, we've been designed into very generalist tools who have solved 1,000 problems, but only one time. We're like a mile wide and an inch deep, whereas industry is looking for somebody who's a mile deep and probably only a few inches wide in a lot of cases, and again with a lot of different variants there. So I think that's such a great point, Jay, is being able to articulate where you actually are more than a couple inches deep, where you do have the intersection of experience and your natural abilities and your passion to go much deeper on certain problems so you can solve those for industry and convey that well in conversations that you have. That's such a great point there.
Yep. Yeah, no, we see ourselves as Gerbers or Leatherman tools. And industry wants a hammer to drive a nail and a screwdriver to drive a screw. And yeah, you can technically drive a screw with a Gerber, but it's not very good. And you're certainly not hammering anything. So
Marines will
yeah,
do it.
that's true too. I love it.
they just use their forehead. We ask our guests the same question as we wrap up here. We ask for one, really, what can our audience provide? How can we provide value to you? And then the second part of that question is going to be, how can you provide value, either a nugget of advice or something to the audience? But we'll start with, what can the audience provide you in your current role?
Oh, hey, thanks, Jack. That's an incredible opportunity. So, fairly simple ask. I would ask anybody who listens to this podcast to check out the Red Thread X on LinkedIn. Check us out on our podcast series, which is on YouTube and Spotify. Check out our website. And the reason is this: our title for the first report, and this is really an ethos we carry, our title was Tech's Rapid Advancement, Humanity's Decision, and we called it Convergence. And we looked at everything that's happening in the world that's incredibly good, that could be incredibly bad. And what we really want to see is that people are making deliberate choices about how they're going to use technology. And AI is just a great example. There's this really fine line between, is AI deciding with you or is AI deciding for you? And it's a choice, as long as it's a deliberate choice. Whichever side of that you want to be on is fine. But we just want to make sure that it's a conscious decision and that we're thinking through all these different things that are happening around us so quickly. So our core purpose is really capture those actionable insights and then portray them such that people can make decisions, agencies can make decisions, because like this lack of regulation and governance around certain technologies is really alarming to me. And technology is moving faster than even industry can control it, much less how governments can control it and regulate it. And in the end, I think we're all as individuals going to be the bill payers for that. So that's my ask, is please check out our thinking, because ultimately what we want to do is just drive critical dialogue and informed decisions by anybody who's accessing our material. And then what I would ask others to do is, more than anything else, just stay connected. One of our biggest insights from all of the research and writing we've done to this point in over a year now with Red Thread X is, I think the biggest challenge we face as a species and certainly as a society in America is the crisis of loneliness. Devices are driving us apart. Lots of other things are driving us apart. And that lack of connectedness is eroding the human experience. And I think it's putting individuals at risk, but it's also putting the collective at risk. And so I'm not going to name the name, but I got a cold call yesterday from a guy who had leg surgery right about the time I had shoulder surgery. And he just said, "Hey, I was just thinking about you and I want to see how your recovery's going." And we chatted for a few minutes and we decided to hold each other accountable on getting back to our pre-surgical fitness levels as a result of that call. He had the idea to call me. We made that connection as people, and that's going to carry through over time. And that gives me that true sense of purpose through that connectedness with others. So that's my big ask.
Yeah,
Awesome.
that is awesome. What, you recently had shoulder surgery?
I did.
What was it? Labrum, rotator cuff, all the above?
Thank goodness it was labrum and bone spur. So it was a slap tear and it was a bone spur that was tearing my bicep, but the rotator cuff was intact still. Yeah, the
Awesome. Yeah.
doc told me, he's like, "You're gonna wake up and if it's this sling, you're happy. If it's this sling, you got 6 extra weeks."
Well, I've had two shoulders myself, and it was this sling, the
Oh,
further up one. So I feel for you there. I hope the recovery goes quickly. Bands are your friend. A lot of
yes.
band work, I'm sure, is in your future and currently dictating your day. Well, Jay, it's always a pleasure to connect. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast. And Jack, just for reference here, Jay once mentioned people falling into two camps from the Army, either a big map person or a little map person. And so all three of us coming from the big map world where we're on mounted vehicles that are actually moving more than a couple grid squares at a time, thus the need for a map board and not just some like folded up square in your cargo pocket. It's always good to connect with a fellow big map person who sees the world in a similar way and is thinking critically, reinventing yourself like you have, and making big things happen in the world. And again, thank you for the way that you got my Army career started on the right foot. And I'm sure that's just one of countless other stories of you doing the same for others. So thank you for what you have done and continue to do.
Absolutely. And so for the veterans out there, just one request, pay it forward. Somebody invested in you to get you to where you are. Just find that person who needs the investment and please pay it forward.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Veteran Ventures Podcast. If you heard something interesting or found the show to be helpful, send it to a friend who is transitioning out of the military or considering a transition. We'd also really appreciate if you left a rating and review of the show. That helps us reach more people with these amazing stories of successful veterans. We'll catch you next time on the Veteran Ventures Podcast. And until then, go do the thing. Make that decision, have that conversation, and go find your next mission.